Good morning, everyone. My name is Ella Prihatini, and this is our presentation, our paper presentation by me, my colleagues at Binus University, Dr. Lily Yuliadi Arnakim and Galodian Permana Dewi MA. So, the title of this presentation is Women's Parliamentary Representation and Government Spending in Singapore. What do we know so far? A growing uh, body of literature have shown that women's political representation is associated with increases in social spending, government spending on family benefits, and government spending on health and social welfare. On the other hand, women's share in parliament is associated with decreases in defense spending, indicating the priority change that occurs once women are significantly contributing to political decision making processes. Furthermore, women's participation in the labor force is also associated with better economic performance measured by the GDP per capita. However, the literature on this issue and women's substantive impacts on fiscal policy has been dominated by the Western context. Little is known about women's substantive representation in um, how about women's substantive representation is actually taking place in non-Western advanced economies. Thus, this paper aims to shed some light into Singapore, one of the richest countries in Asia and in the world, with relatively stable democracy. Women were very underrepresented in Singapore's early politics, with all male legislators from 1970 to the 1984. Yet the number of female candidates increased from zero in 1980 to 32 by 2011, and women's legislative representation reached a high of 23% after the 2010 general election. And as of 2020, almost 30% of MPs in Parliament of Singapore are female, and almost 40%, or likely 40% of MPs are under 45 years old. With the significant increase of women's seat in Parliament, the current paper investigates the correlation between women's political and economic participation and government welfare spending. It aims to answer the following question: does Singapore experience, in line with the literature, on the influence of women's representation and fiscal policy? In the case, government expenditure on education and health. So this study covers the years starting from 1970 up until 2020. Using a qualitative approach, this paper finds that um, the next section discusses about the data and method. So what are the variables and the sources of the data that we use? So we used two main sources, which are the World Development Indicators and gender statistics. So for the first two variables are the proportion of seats held by women in national parliament, which accounts for female political participation. The second variable is the ratio of female to male labor force participation, which represents women's economic participation. These two are gathered from the gender statistics provided by the World Bank. The next variables are domestic general the government health expenditure percentage of GDP. So this percentage uh, indicates the government spending on health relative to total GDP. So it is a widely used proxy to gauge the government's priority in providing a healthcare system. Following to that is the government expenditure on education, the percentage of government expenditure. So this variable is the proportion of education expend. So the proportion of education in the government total expenditure. Lastly, we also use GDP per capita using the current the current American dollar as a variable to measure the economic success over the years. All data were collected from the World Bank indicators. So the method that we use are twofold. The first one is the correlation matrix. So we run the correlation test with all the variables. Following to that is the bivariate regression analysis to calculate the influence of women's parliamentary representation on government welfare spending. And some key takeaways from our findings are number one is that, as you can see here, the correlation matrix. So the correlation matrix suggests that women's parliamentary representation correlates strongly with GDP per capita, 0.8, and also female to male labor force participation, which is higher than the GDP, 0.91. And unexpectedly, the correlation is rather weak for the education spending. It's not statistically significant, but also the health expenditure is positively correlated with the percentage of female seats in parliament, 0.6. All of these correlation are quite accurate with the significance level at p less than 0.05. What is also interesting from this matrix is that we can see the female economic participation is highly correlated, is strongly correlated with GDP. So this in particular tells us that the success of Singapore over the years in terms of its economic development is very closely associated with women's actively participating in the labor force and vice versa. So we would argue that having women in the labor force has helped Singapore to achieve its impressive economic development in the last 50 years. And also, with higher GDP, women's activity in the labor force is continue to increase in line with the availability of women as as a employees. With a rather weaker correlation here is that between the labor force participation and health, indicating that the spending on health is strongly associated with women's economic participation rather than with the women in parliament. What is surprising for us to discover is that the correlation between women in parliament and the education spending is not significant. Well, we could argue that the government of Singapore is already massively investing in education sector. So one of the key indicators of this success is how Singapore continues to be on the top of the list on the PISA ranking. And Singapore has been extensively investing in education, as I said, and thus women in parliament will not really influence or did not really influence how the government spending on education really is. So it's already one of the top priorities, and therefore we don't see the connection or the substantive representation of having more women in parliament reflecting on the expenditure of the government in the education sector. So that's one of the key takeaways that we can provide, as can be seen in this matrix. The other key findings that we can share with you here is that the equation. So how can we predict the number or the percentage or the government health spending in the last 50 years with women in parliament as the variable that we can measure. To predict this outcome, we came up with this formula. So the health spending by the government is uh, 3.5 plus zero point 0.3 times the percentage of women in parliament. So this is suggesting that um, every percent of increase in the women's parliamentary representation, we have a strong we will see that the health spending increase by 0.23%. So 0.23% in the health spending with the coefficient 3.5. What about the spending on education? So as we can see, the coefficient here is the constant is only 3.5, and the coefficient is only 0.3 times the percentage of women in parliament. Compare that with this, the education spending. We can see that the constanta is already high, almost 18. So the starting point of education spending education spending compared to the total GDP is already high, right? It's 18%. While here, let me come back to this, the health spending is only 3.5. So having this huge constant to begin with, we would argue that the education spending is already high uh, to begin with this formula, and having more women in the parliament is not really a strong indication as to how education spending is being spent by the government. So this supports our earlier findings, which suggest that which the correlation metrics suggesting that the government spending on education is not really strongly associated with how many women in parliament. But it does really show that for the health spending, yes, having more women in parliament is important because it has a strong correlation with the health spending. So, what can be confirmed from our study? A couple of important confirmations to make. So, our essay has argued that the proportion of seats held by women in the Parliament of Singapore relates positively with higher government spending on health expenditure, 0.58. Our analysis shows that government spending on education has not been closely associated with the percentage of female MPs. Hence, the experience in Singapore only supports some part of the literature on women's substantive representation in fiscal policy. Further study needs to delve into this difference between the two types of government spending. What factors contribute to the less significant correlation between the percentage of female lawmakers and government spending on education? Additionally, Singapore's success in economic development is strongly correlated with women's participation in the labor force, 0.95. We have demonstrated that having more women in the labor force is one of the key factors that has helped Singapore to achieve its economic power today. Female labor force participation is also strongly correlated with the share of women in parliament, 0.91, suggesting that women's access to the labor force is helping women to access politics. Whilst offering some support to the literature, this paper is limited in terms of comparative perspective. Therefore, further study might benefit from comparing Singapore with other developed economies in Asia, such as other economies in Asia with similar political and social cultural settings. Thank you for your listening, and we need to acknowledge that this work is supported by the Research and Technology Transfer Office at Bina Nusantara University as part of Bina Nusantara University's international research grant entitled Gender Representation and Development in Southeast Asia, with contract number 26/VR.RTT/4/2020. The contract date was signed on the 6th of April 2020. Thank you so much again for your listening, and I look forward to hear from you. Please uh, don't hesitate to contact us or contact me as the corresponding author for this work of research. Ella.prihatini at Binus University at binus.edu. Sorry. Thank you and have a lovely day. Bye.